happening again. And just found myself here now doing something I loved, but the programming and conditioning was starting to make its way into it again and taking the value out of it. And what I realized is, oh, this isn't a product of me and the work that I do. This is a product of the way that I think. And as long as I continue to think or come from a mind frame that there is something missing within me or in my life that I am lacking, then I'm always going to want more. And as
Yes.
long as I'm wanting more, I'm going to be on that, in that rut, on that rat
Right. And you're going
race.
to keep chasing things without outside of yourself. Like,
Right.
what's the next thing? What's the next thing?
And I just realized that that's absolutely empty, that it was an illusion
Yeah.
because here I had accomplished all of this stuff. And yet I
Mhm.
was feeling this same thing. So I wanted to find out what that was.
Hello, I'm Danielle Kane, and welcome to another episode of the Conscious Broadcast. This is a place where the collective comes together to share their conscious journey. And I please ask you to like and subscribe to the Conscious Broadcast so we can continue to grow our stories and our message to everybody else. Today's guest is Dr. Carlos Garcia. He is a psychologist and owns Tampa Counseling and Wellness. His company is all about really getting to know each person and help them on their healing journey. But before he even became a psychologist, he has quite the journey. He's been a refugee of Cuba, a Marine, and even a firefighter. So he's going to take us down this journey today. And I look forward to what you guys think. So, welcome, Dr. Carlos Garcia, to the Conscious Broadcast. Why don't you start off with telling us a little bit about your upbringing?
Yeah. So I was actually born in Cuba and came to the United States to live in Florida in Miami with my parents when I was 2 as political refugees. Grew up in Miami, with immigrant parents. So, they worked really hard to sort of put food on the table and, provide for my brother and I. I had an older brother, 8 years older. Grew up in Miami, partied a lot. I mean, it was kind of the city that city life that you grew up around. Um, and then, sort of in high school, my sophomore and junior, and then my senior year, I started to notice that I was kind of really losing interest for education, and I wasn't really. I had really started to lose my path in a way. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my life. So coming up on my senior year, um, partly I had wanted to sort of repay the country for the freedom that they provided my family and I that we wouldn't have otherwise had in Cuba, and I sort of felt like this need to want to repay the country for that. So I joined the Marines. So 2 weeks after high school, I found myself in the Marine Corps in boot camp. Real sort of culture shock for someone who had grown up, just
Mhm.
in one town his whole life. I think in addition to learning a lot about sort of discipline and motivation, I really was really started to learn a lot about myself. Right, pushed in ways that when you sort of have these challenging life circumstances that push you in a way
Sure.
that growth is inevitable. That's
Yeah.
sort of what the Marine Corps did for me.
Well, even
Uh,
just like your upbringing, leaving Cuba and coming to this country, different values than your parents know.
totally.
And, like I'm assuming, worked very hard to try to provide for you guys. What did your parents do?
Yeah. So, I think one of the pieces that's important, because maybe later in the life story it'll be pertinent,
Mhm.
Danielle. But we had a really comfortable life back in Cuba, right? Until sort of Fidel Castro took over. And what I mean by that is we lived in a big house. My mom didn't have to work. She got to take care of me and my brother, along with, aunts and uncles. My dad was an engineer. I mean, we had a really good
Wow.
life.
I'm
And
really
here,
glad that you shared that because I don't know much. I only know that in Cuba, like it's terrible. Like you
yeah, yeah,
obviously have to. I mean,
yeah,
it's communist. So
yeah,
all we
yeah.
know
But
is
there was a
that you
time
have
where
to.
it wasn't.
So it
Totally.
was. It
Right.
was prior to him that you kind of would you say would be more of a capitalist type of lifestyle, or is it completely different?
Yeah, I mean, I think Fidel Castro in the '60s came in selling a vision of what this sort of idealistic Cuba that was going to take place.
Hmm.
And then over time, his story started to change, right? And it was more of communism. It was more of him taking control of all of the land and the entire
Wow.
country. And so, by the 80s when we left, we were, people were starting to see that, like, whoa, these ideas that he was talking about at first are not taking place, and what's actually happening here is things are getting worse and worse. So um literally it was a day where this is a story from my parents where they were like, look, Fidel Castro is letting some people leave the country. There's some boats coming to get people from the United States. Do you want to leave? So, like, literally in 2 days, my parents had to scurry, give away what they had. The rest was getting
Wow.
taken care of, but taken by the government. And literally, we left Cuba with just the clothes on our backs and nothing else. That was it. I mean, we were parting ways completely and fully.
How did you guys, I mean, I know you were only 2, but where
Yeah.
did you guys land? I mean, where did you stay with any
Yeah.
other refugees? How did that work
Yeah,
out for you?
so we were fortunate in that group of almost 125,000 Cubans that landed in Miami or the Keys area over the period of 6 months in 1980. That's what sort of changed that whole cultural vibration of Miami in the 80s and 90s. But my dad had a sister that had moved to the United States with her husband some years ahead of us. So
Mhm.
when they found out that Cuba was opening up their borders, people took to these boats, and so they were sending boats over to come and get family members. And so we were able to stay with my aunt in Miami
Okay, good.
while my parents sort of found jobs and were able to find things that to help us get settled.
Yeah. Wow, that is like a really amazing story to
Yeah,
be,
yeah,
a refugee. I mean,
yeah,
seriously, that's we
yeah.
you don't come across those stories very often.
Right,
And like
right.
like you said, you lived a great life and then quickly we see what can happen
Totally.
to make that
Yeah,
shift.
the way I sort of frame it for people, and even to put myself in my parents' shoes, like, imagine you're in your 30s, you got a couple kids,
Yeah.
you're settled in your life, and now all of a sudden you have to leave everything behind, move to a country where you don't know the language, where you don't know the place, where you don't know
Right.
anything, and start from the beginning. I mean,
Talk
just
about a huge
imagine.
shift in being uncomfortable. And even like us globally, like I think we're all have had felt what it's
Yeah,
like to have a shift, maybe not to the same level, but it could happen at any
yeah,
time.
yeah. The uncertainty, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So growing up now in Miami and wasn't really resonating with school and said, hey, I'm going to go to the Marine Corps because
Yeah,
I want to give back. So
yeah,
that's kind of where we are.
yeah,
All right.
yeah,
So tell me a little bit about what it was like to join the Marine Corps. How, what you talked a lot about the training and the conditioning. Can you
yeah,
give me a little bit more
yeah,
feedback on that?
yeah. Well, yeah, I can speak to the military in general, but to the Marine Corps specifically. The Marine Corps has a very sort of unique way of training you,
Okay.
right from the first day you arrive there. And I would say, and probably people in other branches of services might disagree, but I've talked to so many people in other branches of service that say, yeah, the Marine Corps, like, they really create a warrior, a fighting machine.
Mm,
And they're essentially what their mo is. You get there and they strip you of your whole entire identity.
really?
No
How do they
longer,
do that?
well, you're no longer a name. You no longer refer to yourself by your name. You refer to yourself as recruit or by your number. And so, right, they shave everybody's head so you look like everyone else. They strip everything that you have identified yourself with as a personality up until that point, and you no longer belong to you. You belong to them. It's right. The Marine Corps caught. It's the Marine Corps
So
camouflage
you're like
clothes.
a property, almost like you got
You're
to
a
do
piece of
whatever they
property,
say.
and
Yeah.
every piece of article of clothing has your number on it, and that's all that you are for 3 months.
Wow.
Um, Now, the messaging that comes from the drill instructors and just sort of the entire sort of culture is that you're nothing, you're scum, you're the nothing of the earth.
So all negative feedback every day in and out.
Every
Just
day, just being told that exactly right, just really,
I just never understand that here you're serving your country and but we're going to treat the people serving the country with
right,
this
right,
behavior of feeling like they're not worth it.
totally. So I can see the other side of things, Danielle,
Yeah,
and that
and I'd
is
love for you to
that.
share that. Yeah.
Right. From a the perspective of the government or the military, the purpose of the military is to have a resource, even though in this instance it's a human resource, to fight wars
Right.
and to be in battle.
So they can't have the emotions attached with that. Right.
What do you need emotions for? You need to be a killing machine. I mean, sorry,
Yeah.
right? Like
Right.
we're going to put you in the most grueling of circumstances, psychologically, emotionally, and physically, so that you learn how to cope, or how to navigate those moments, so that when we put you in a situation where there is war, where there is, right, where you don't have the luxuries of life that you normally would, you're able to function and survive.
Right.
From that perspective, I get it. But that is a very short term objective. And I don't think that the military and the government see the long term, right? The consequences of building that sort of human.
Yeah.
And we can get into how we are seeing massive amounts of PTSD, suicide, depression, anxiety, and other various forms of trauma in the military, right? But you can't take a human and recondition their brain, do nothing with their emotional capacity, send them into environments where they're killing other people or seeing people killed around them, and then expect the human heart to be okay.
Yeah. Right.
But it's just, right, when your vision is this far in the thing, you just do this work, and they do this work really well,
But it's
right?
like it's like, haven't we learned over time this might not be the best method?
Right,
It's not like this, we just tried it one time and like, oh,
right,
yep,
right.
we messed up a lot of people's lives
A lot of,
afterwards.
right,
There's
for
no
years and
there's
years
no
and years.
plan afterward.
Right,
If there is an afterward,
right.
right?
And so now what we see in society is this scurrying to find, oh, okay, we have 17 to 20 veterans killing themselves every day. Oh, now let's respond. We're such a reactive society. We just go on doing things until we realize we're doing massive damage and harm, and then we want to react and try to fix. But the momentum that we set in place with that harm is hard to catch up to.
Would you say that what's the worst part about it? Would you say the conditioning is harder, just or not as bad as the actual? I mean, if some people might not ever make it to
Yeah,
the battlefield,
yeah.
can you give me a little bit of your
Yeah,
experience?
I mean, one of the ways that I can sort of speak to this is, and I want to, I want to be mindful, because some of this isn't necessarily available information or news that people might, be readily able to find, or to understand. I don't know whether this is intentional or not, but there is if you were to look at the demographic and social economic status of many of the people that go into the military, they tend to come from not middle and upper class, but lower class segments of the society. A lot of people that go into the military to escape, their town, their home, abusive situations. So, um, part of what we need to understand is that a lot of times, most of the people, by the time, even at 18, 17, when they come into the military, they have already been enduring and undergoing other forms of trauma, whether financial, physical, psychological abuse. I mean, all kinds of things. Um, and that's important, because if you send somebody who's grown up in an environment like that feels worthless,
Hmm.
that feels not enough in the world, and then they find this community where they can shine and strive around a bunch of other people that have similar traumas, right? Like, what are we doing? Like, the culture for many years, and in a lot of forms of services, are drinking and fighting and, right, aggressiveness, and like it's almost like you wear that as a badge of honor.
Yeah.
And so, again, in those cultures, it feels absolutely normal. So here you might have an 18-year-old who grew up in a very sort of toxic or unhealthy emotional and psychological environment. And now they spend a minimum of 4 to, who knows, 12, 20 years in a similar environment. And now they come out and they're in the real world, and they have zero sort of social skills or awareness to deal with a world that isn't so structured all of the
Right.
time, that isn't
Right.
telling you what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. And so a lot of trauma, or a lot of the challenges and difficulty that I see of folks coming out of the military, isn't always necessarily tied to some combat experience or PTSD experience, is that they had lived under this functioning, under these rules, under these forms of thinking, and then don't have the flexibility of mind or heart to be in a world that's very gray afterwards.
Totally. And I can even say that just coming out of school, they
Yeah.
teach you raise your hand if you have to use the bathroom. You can't just get up and leave, or,
Right.
it's always raising your hand. And then it wasn't until you get to college where you're like, I can just go.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's just minor programming, then going to this whole level where, our brains are still developing. And
True.
so now we're being fed this new lifestyle that this is the way it is. And then
Yes.
you get put out in the world when you're like, okay, what do I do now?
Right.
I can
Right.
only imagine. You feel like it's like an abandoned dog just thrown on the side of the road.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember a conversation with someone who's become a good friend. Got out of the Marine Corps, and one of the things that he was struggling with in that first year was just inflexibility, like an inability to have adaptability. You would think, but wait, he was in the military. Yeah, he was able to use that adaptability in the military. But things he would tell me is like, it's Tuesday. I got to do my laundry on Tuesday. If I don't do my laundry on Tuesday, then like, I'm not setting my objectives and my goals right. And it's like, whoa, like, how about just doing your laundry Wednesday? But it's so ingrained into you, those patterns of right and wrong, good and bad,
Yeah.
that we don't have the flexibility of mind again to see that um, true life living in the
Yeah.
real world takes massive amounts of adaptability, because the world is uncertain. I mean, look what happened to us a
Yeah.
couple of years ago when COVID came.
Yeah.
We didn't know what the hell to do with ourselves. I mean, we ran to the stores and we're buying up toilet paper. We didn't even know why.
Right.
That's how
Right.
humans respond to uncertainty.
Yes. Yes. And the uncertainty of when like the lockdowns were going to be done. I'm sure that triggered many, many um memories for veterans or and other things where it's like we're in lockdown, like we got
Yeah,
to be prepared.
yeah,
And I
scared.
don't think that's by accident either.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you for giving me some
Yeah,
more details on your
sure,
your thought process
sure.
of how others and yourself may have experienced it.
Yeah, yeah.
So, what happened after you decided to leave, and why did you decide to leave? Did you choose your departure?
Yeah, I chose to get out 8 years after. It sort of just felt like the right time. I realized that the military. I've always been identified from very early on as, right, the black sheep, the one that goes against the grain. And so the military is not the kind of
Were
place
you
for a person.
asking all the questions?
Yeah, yeah. They didn't like me asking all the questions, wanting to do things my way. It just,
Yep.
we weren't jiving, right?
Yeah.
And there's a real sort of, systemic, bureaucratic, sort of ego-driven sort of culture that just didn't feel in line with the direction I wanted to take my life next. And I had always kind of wanted to go, back to school, and sort of, even though school hadn't been a thing that I sort of loved, I knew that at least the programming in my mind at that time is, without a degree, you can't be successful, and that was part of my truth at the time. Programming, like you were saying. So I thought, I should probably leave, start taking some classes, and sort of building my life. I did have some dreams of eventually meeting a partner, settling down, having a life in that way.
Okay.
So part of that transition was, my brother had been in the police department for some time. I thought it sort of seemed like a logical sort of next step to go into civil service. And so I tried applying for the police department a couple times down in the Miami area. It's a pretty hard and lengthy process. And along that process, a good friend I had met some years back was in the process of trying to become a fireman. And he said to me one day, he's like, "Why are you going to become a cop? Like, people hate cops. Cops get shot at. Like, come become a fireman and
Don't
work."
get shot.
Yeah, don't get shot at, dude. What do you want
Just
that
go
for?
into like that fire that's burning
I
over
know,
here.
I know. Somehow that made sense. I was like, yeah, I'll run into fires. But he's like, we work 9 days a month. He's like, at the time I was, single. He's like, women love firemen. I was like, I'm sold. You say no more. Right?
I
Um,
love it.
yeah. So, and I had been a lifeguard previously, and I liked sort of that first responder EMT stuff.
And I'm very grateful for you guys because you still
Thank
are
you.
giving the service to your
Yeah.
community,
Yeah.
the police, the firemen. I mean, and a lot of that is volunteer. I don't know if that was even
In a
paid,
lot of
but
places. Yeah. In a lot
yeah.
of places, it is. Absolutely. And then, yeah, so I kind of just found myself applying. I got hired by the fire department. They put me through the fire academy and through paramedic school and EMT school and all of that stuff. And I was really enjoying the work I was doing. I mean, it was very, very rewarding work. It's great when you only work 9 days a month. You
Mhm.
do get a lot of downtime. Um, but I think also what that contributed to, there was a lot that had transpired in my childhood that I came to later find out through my own therapy that was impeding me in a lot of ways. And while I had this wonderful job and I was healthy and I was, sort of confident, or at least I thought it was a sort of an empty confidence at that time in my life.
Okay.
On the outside, I seemed like the happiest, go lucky, just wonderful person. But on the inside, I was constantly struggling with anxiety and depression and constantly struggling with these feelings of being worthless and just not worthy. Experiencing a ton of anger and frustration that I couldn't just seem to grasp and understand. And so a lot of that is what led me to therapy the first time. I mean, I was like, look, I'm an emotional wreck. Sometimes I get super sad and I cry like at the silliest things, like those Publix holiday commercials, right? Like they get me every time. I don't know if there's Publix up there. It's a local grocery store.
No.
And for every time at the end of the year for the holidays, they have these heartfelt, like beautiful family, commercials that just tug at your heart.
No. Yeah.
And I'm like, one moment I'm crying over that, and the next moment I'm like in a full rage. And like,
Yeah.
how do I understand my emotions better?
Do you feel like this was something that you have had, like you said, you were talking about your childhood, since childhood, and then like maybe putting yourself through the Marines,
Yeah,
um, and just like the fire department, it suppressed those emotions for a
totally,
while?
totally.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So what I came to understand over the years that a lot of it was my depression and anxiety was coming from a real suppression of my emotions. To add to that, I had always been a child that just felt things deeply. I was a very sort of emotional child, but there wasn't room for that in a Hispanic house with immigrant parents. You were told to suck it up. I mean, you received a spanking, and if you started crying, it's like, oh, you really want me to give you something to cry about? It was that kind of a message.
Mhm.
And so I hadn't realized the ways that as a child I started to repress emotions, started to, just kind of build everything like this sort of pressure cooker, I say. But as you know, when you're a child, you don't have the prefrontal cortex developed enough to understand the relationship between and consequences of certain things.
Mhm.
And a lot of us learn to sort of look at our lives. And like, I remember, for instance, Danielle, when I moved to Fort Lauderdale, that I was finding a therapist there and we were having a first session. And I had described to her like what my upbringing was like, this really harsh father, a really angry older brother that like I would
Who
uh
knows what he was getting and why he
yeah,
was angry? Yeah,
totally,
right?
totally,
Mhm. Yeah.
exactly. But I remember sharing that story and her saying like, wow, that was very traumatic and abusive. And I chuckled, like I laughed. I was like, what do you mean? I was like, that was just a Hispanic upbringing. And so I think a lot of us house our because we don't see it as traumatic, we house the things that happened to us in our past as just like okay or ordinary or not that big of a deal, right? Like, oh, my dad drank every day. Yeah, that's sort of how it was until you realize not everybody's father drank every day, right?
Right, right,
Like, oh, my parents fought and like we're at each other's throat every day. Oh, that's not every household. Like, oh, right.
right.
So when you start growing up and becoming an adult and seeing that's not
This
always
was
the
your
case,
normal, like, this was your normal day-to-day life,
that
so
was my
you just
day to
have to
day.
survive that, and you create whatever you need,
Right.
armor, like you said, I have to create this armor because I can't, show who I really am and my
Yeah.
emotions, so
Yeah, because the
yeah,
people around me are not safe to show that
right,
aspect of
right.
myself. And so I think you're absolutely right. We start to hide those versions of ourselves. And I think you used a beautiful word there that I was doing, but not aware of till later. I was surviving. I felt like I
Yeah,
was in such a chaotic environment that I had to constantly survive. Now, if you put a 6-year old in an environment where they're having to survive, they don't have the opportunities to develop a solid sense of self, a solid self esteem, a confidence, an ability to learn how to navigate their environment emotionally, psychologically, in a healthy way. Well, then I got thrown 2 weeks after high school into the military.
Right.
Again, a constant
It's
surviving.
almost like this fight or flight, and you never are actually in a place where you feel like you're grounded because
Right,
you're constantly going to that next, and then
right,
that stays within your cells. So it's this constant
right.
repeat pattern of stress,
Totally,
right? Yeah.
totally. And so the programming starts to generalize or encompass other aspects of your life. So here I was living a life of self-sabotage, living a life of if good things came, or things that would probably settle my life. Well, what I'm used to is agitation and chaos. So I'm going to create a life for myself consciously or unconsciously of chaos.
Mhm.
And one of the ways that I describe it to people now is like if you leave the house every morning with like full set of like warrior gear, right? Your spear and your cape and your shield.
Yeah.
What do you think you're going to find that day?
Right.
I mean, come on, right?
You just
So
reminded me of Avatar. We're going to
yeah,
the
yeah,
jungle.
like we're going to war. What do you think you're
Right.
going to
Right.
find in your life? Chaos and war.
Yeah.
Yeah, I on the outside everything looked great, and there was always a smile on my face, and I was able to put on that mask and be what everybody needed me to be, and the fun guy and all of that stuff, and a great fireman. But on the inside, I felt lost, I felt alone, I felt afraid, I felt confused. And for me, at least, I think that's where a lot of my depression and anxiety was manifesting. And fortunately, I was able to find some really great therapists along the way that helped me look at my anger, helped me look at how I was showing up in relationships, how I viewed relationships, how I viewed my relationship with myself, how I thought about myself, all of those different aspects that were so critical for me to know, and to grow from.
That's great. And I'm so glad. And I think that inspired you, right, into your next
Right.
journey.
Yeah.
So why don't you
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about how you got
Yeah.
started with being
Yeah.
the
So totally. I you know, I want to say this as sort of as I reflect on my life. A lot of people look at my life and they're like, "Oh, Carlos, man, you did this and you've done so many things," and they see me as this person that like must have set all these awesome goals and achieved. And I'm like, no, it has all been like stumbling into things,
yeah,
taking detours, finding a
yeah.
lot of things that I didn't
The
want to
path
do.
could have been straight, but you're like, not me.
No, no. Look at this one. This
Which
looks
I
really
could
bumpy
relate.
and spiny. Let's go that way, right?
Yes, right. Anything that could cause some like scrapes along the way.
Yeah,
We're gonna
yeah,
jump in
yeah.
fires.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the whole thing of joining the Marine Corps out of all the military is because I knew it was the hardest. And it's
Yeah,
like, let's go full in, right? Let's go
yeah.
full in. Because I had struggled with all of these sort of parts of me, if you will. I had always been really into self-help books and understanding this part of me and that part of me. And here I was about to turn 30. Again, I was working at the fire department. But my life just felt empty. I didn't feel like I was doing anything of value and purpose. And not to minimize, like, I worked around these firemen whose fathers and grandfathers, like this was like what brought them joy and happiness. And that part was missing for me. And I came across this book. It was called The Success Principles: How to Get from Where You Are to Where You Want to Be. And it's authored by Jack Canfield, who's the co-author of all the
Mm,
Chicken Soup for the Soul.
yes, yes. Love
Um,
him.
and whether I was ripe and ready or whether it was the particular things in this book, I think it's always a combination of both, right? Um, I started to see a lot of the ways in which I had these limited ways of thinking, um, that I was capable of so much more. For example, like I aced EMT school. I was the top of my paramedic school. Like life was showing me that these thoughts that I had that I'm not good at school, I was being challenged in my beliefs about myself. And this book did that in a significant way. So it started to show me like, holy shit, like the sky's the limit.
Yeah.
And so this like fire that had been in there just kind of raged. And I was like, okay, like, what are we going to do? It's time to walk away from this job and find what that next mission, that next purpose is. Um, I had always gravitated to Tony Robbins, and I was like, I'm going to go be a coach and a motivational speaker, and that's what my heart's purpose feels like I'm supposed to do. So in doing that, I didn't want to be some sort of just self-proclaimed coach, right? I was like, I really want to understand this stuff from a much deeper level. And also as a challenge to myself, I'm going to go get a doctorate degree. And so I left the fire department and became a student again for 5 years and another year of internship. And people were like, man, you're crazy. Like you have this stable career, like you have
Yeah.
great benefits, like just, stay a little bit longer. And, like why leave? And just everything in my heart was telling me that there was something else for me to do. And so when I get to grad school, I happened to get into a program that was very clinically based, so therapy. And I remember my second year, which is when you start to see clients, being in that therapy office, sitting in front of my first client, and being like, "I'm home. Like this is where I'm supposed to be. This is the work I'm supposed to be doing right now." And the rest is kind of, I was able to pull on my own therapy experiences, my own struggles. And one of the things that I found, like there's a massive amount of like therapists, psychologists out there that have never been to therapy. And that always just was like, I don't understand that. Right.
How can
Like
you give therapy if you've never
Right.
like
If you don't know
taken
what
care
it's
of
like to
yourself?
sit on that other couch,
Yeah.
right? But here,
Yeah.
that's like years of experience that I had, and so I think the way that it helped me sort of understand my clients when they came in with really heavy stuff, like when somebody would come in and be like, "My anxiety has me like through the roof, and the panic attacks are too much." I can go into a place within myself and be like, "Right, yeah, I know what you mean," and that must feel
Very relatable. Well,
so
you think
relatable.
about doctors in general, like if you go to the doctor for whatever, they're
Yeah,
not always going to the doc. I mean, yeah, I guess they go to a
yeah.
doctor themselves, but
Right.
I guess there's
Who's
this
telling
like
you, hey, you really should stop smoking, and then on their
right,
break is out there, having a cigarette.
right. But there's this like pedestal I feel like we put like where they, oh no, they couldn't see
Yeah.
a therapist themselves. But I think that's so important to be able to relate. And based on your experience, I mean, I think you've helped so many people
Thank
with
you.
having your story
Yeah.
and being able to support them.
Totally. And Danielle, one of the things that I found was, as I stepped into my own vulnerability and shared my own struggles with my clients, like the way that they were able to then open up, the shame would sort of dissipate and not be in the room anymore, because they would look at me and be like, "Oh, so you get this too, so you've struggled too." And it removes this like immediate sense of like shame that they're coming into, because whenever we're struggling with something in life, our tendency is, before we understand where the programming comes from or why we're that way, we tend to blame ourselves.
Yeah.
And so we're carrying around this massive amount of guilt and shame because, like, I'm broken. There must be something wrong with me. Look at everybody else. Everyone else has got their shit together. Why don't I? And until they come in here and we start to sort of understand all of the pieces that contributed to that, you start to see sort of that shame and guilt fall away. And when you can, sort of like I say to people now, when you can show up in life and take off your mask and show people that you're human and that you struggle too,
Yeah.
we create a really warm invitation for other people to take off their mask as well.
Absolutely. I think vulnerability and being authentic is so important. And it really does help, let people open up a little bit and
Totally.
trust. And I don't think we were raised, you're not raised to
No,
be off, like to do those
no.
things,
We're raised the opposite. We're,
Yeah.
we're, we're told to feel shame around feeling sad, to feel shame around being angry, to feel shame around failing, to feel shame around, right? And so of course we're going to hide those parts of us. We don't want anybody to see it. And so we end up struggling and isolating and struggling privately. And again, I think that is a big cause of a lot of the depression and anxiety I see in society.
I appreciate you sharing that too, because it's like you wonder, and when does it come out? If you have the seasonal depression,
Right.
what is it that triggers that response? Could
Yeah.
be anything, I guess, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And, we can sort of get into the different forms of depression. I mean, I think there are, a lot of mental health conditions, including depression, bipolar disorder,
Yeah.
schizophrenia, that are very biologically based, right? It
Okay.
does has very much to do with the neurochemistry, not only in the brain, but as we're finding now, gut health is a huge
Okay.
piece. Another part of it is what I call environmental, right? Like we deal with difficult life circumstances, the death of a loved one, we're going through a divorce, we're, maybe not parenting in the way that we wish that we could, and so those challenging life circumstances also impact us emotionally.
Yeah, yeah, and me not really, having a background, but also I can see too, like my family's upbringing, my parents, like I
Yeah.
always say that I'm so grateful
Yeah.
for the life that I have, even though we've had our own traumas, but what they went
Mm.
through. I mean,
Right.
they had to create
Right.
whatever to be
Right.
safe,
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
of the experience of, maybe there wasn't a lot of love in their family, or, my dad was one of 11 children, and like you get lost in that. And it's,
Right.
the Spanish culture, and he had other siblings that eventually came
Exactly.
out. So it's like those kind of
Yeah.
behaviors and the
Yeah.
traumas that they have to go through.
Yeah. And
Um,
I think, right, understand, like, it isn't, it isn't a product of like who's got the bigger trauma.
right, right,
And it isn't in any way to sort of point fingers and be like, my parents effed me up. It's not
right,
that.
right,
But it's understanding your story.
right.
And I think part of how we need to change the conversation is to get away from people thinking that trauma is the only thing that causes us to struggle later in life. And this is a story that I share with a lot of people to help sort of speak to that message, Danielle. So let's say here's this little girl, and she's going out to eat with her parents, right? They go out to eat every Friday. And on this particular Friday, the very loving parents are like, we're going to let her pick what she wants to eat today, starts to build a sense of autonomy and responsibility for herself. So the little girl gets super excited, gets to the restaurant, opens the menu, sees this big, delicious, cheesy pizza, points to the pizza. She's, I want the pizza. And mom, in her loving way, just being careful, is like, honey, are you sure you always get the burger? Why don't you get that? So the little girl stops and thinks about it for a minute, sticks to her guns. No, the pizza. And then mom, just kind of wanting to be, mom, as many moms may be at times. What if you don't like the pizza, dear? You know that the burger is the safe bet. Why don't you get that? So the little girl stops and thinks about it again, but sticks to her guns. And she's like, no, the pizza. And then the other parent, dad, chimes in and says, we're not getting the pizza's too big. You're not going to eat it all. It's going to be a waste of money. So the little girl's like, okay, I'll get the burger. Now, the question, Danielle, is in the grand scheme of things, did anything traumatic just transpire? Most of us are like, no, absolutely not. And truthfully, maybe not, right? But the question also is, in that moment, what do you think that that little girl believes about her ability to make decisions?
Not very good. Like she was shut down from her decision.
Right. So maybe my decisions are not good. Maybe I need to check with other people before I make decisions.
Yeah.
Any variety of things. Now, what we can fairly say is that probably that 6-year-old didn't have that rational cognitive thought like an adult would,
Yeah.
but she experienced something in that moment.
Mhm.
What we also know is that that probably wasn't an isolated incident.
Right.
She probably heard a similar message of we know best around piano, ballet, softball, baseball, whatever she engaged in, definitely around school. So let's take it a little further. Do we imagine that over time, this is a girl that starts to develop a little bit of self doubt when making choices?
Absolutely.
Do you imagine if that message continues to be reinforced, that at some point she might start to experience maybe a little discomfort, distress, maybe even
Sure.
anxiety around making life decisions?
Mhm. Absolutely.
Do you imagine that someone that is dealing with that much self doubt, that their confidence and self esteem is impacted? Of course.
Yeah.
From that level of self esteem, what kind of people do you think we allow into our lives? What kind of relationships do we get into?
Probably someone who makes the decision for you, maybe someone a little bit more assertive.
Right.
Yeah.
So, all of this to say, whenever I share this story with anyone, whether it's a client or someone I'm just speaking to in the street, you see that at some point through the story, they're like, oh shit. And they're reflecting on their childhood.
Yeah.
Because again, it isn't about trauma, it's about understanding the things that were going on in our environment, the messages that we were hearing that might have led us unconsciously
Yes.
a place where we believe ourselves to be unworthy, we believe ourselves to be this, that, or the other,
Mhm.
because of the conditioning and the
Yeah.
sort of messages that we
I
hear.
like that story. Thank you for sharing that because that makes sense.
Yeah,
And, being on the parent now, like I can say like, you do the best that you can. And a way
right,
that going back is like I can forgive myself for a lot of things that
right,
have
right.
happened and take ownership for
Yeah,
myself and be
yeah,
able to forgive my parents. Maybe I held on to something.
exactly,
And just like that, you can see,
exactly.
they're just doing the best that they can with what they have.
Right.
And that's where it all comes together. And when you have love in
Yeah.
your family, no matter what, I mean, you can't beat
Yeah.
that because that's what it's all about.
Yeah. And I think it's, it's important because for a lot of years I wasn't able to get to the place in my inner child that was angry, that was in pain as a result of some of the physical abuse and
Yeah,
things like that, because I was covering it up with, yeah, but they were just trying their best.
right. Okay, I can see
Even
that.
though that's true,
The anger
it,
was still much deeper, that
it
that
was
was almost
right,
becoming a lie.
right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
But what I did notice is after I worked through that anger and allowed myself to feel the pain and everything, on the other side, I came back to that place of compassion, of realizing like my mom's dad left when she was 8, my brother's twin brother and like best friend shot himself. Like the trauma that I talked about coming to this country, the kinds of parents that they had.
and
And so
how was your dad
he
reprimanded? Was he
right,
beaten? I'm assuming.
exactly.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
he couldn't have fathered me in another way because he
right,
didn't have the ability to,
yeah,
but that I can still honor the child in me that suffered and
right,
dealt with pain and allow that to go as well.
yeah, yes. Oh, that's so great. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure, sure.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, when you do the work and it's like you said, like, you had to come and revisit that.
Yeah,
You thought you could get through it, like, "Alright, I'll just leave.
right,
School wasn't resonating with me, so I'll just
right,
go to the Marine Corps.
right.
Alright, I'll just stick with this," and just, like,
Yeah,
none of these thoughts were coming about, and then, "Oh, shit. I have an issue here. Here I am, 30, faced with it, and I
yeah,
have to deal with it."
yeah, yeah.
And now you're
And
able to help others.
totally. For me, life had to get so extremely painful in order for me to throw my hands up and say, "Okay, I need help. I can't do this on my own."
And you
And what
surrendered.
and I surrendered.
Were
And what
you
I say
someone that you felt like you didn't need help? Like, most of your life, like, "I can do it myself."
totally. Well, I was hyper independent and I still got to watch for that part of me because again, if you grow up in an environment and the adults in that environment are too preoccupied with their marriage, their
Sure.
drinking, whatever's going on that doesn't allow the emphasis to be on you, you start to feel unsafe in the world because the adults that are supposed to be caring for your emotional, psychological safety are preoccupied.
Right.
So you start to develop this sort of unconscious belief that you're the only one that can care for yourself. So through life, I'm like, nothing to see here. I don't need anybody's help. I got this shit on my own. I got it.
Yeah.
And that what was driving me to continue to suffer through all of these things without asking for help until the pain and suffering was so much that I just had to give in. And so what I tell a lot of people is, some people that's the way they're going to learn life lessons, and I don't judge it. It's okay. It's the way I learned
It's
a
their
lot of
way.
mine. Right. But we don't have to always go there. We don't have to always reach that like place where we're just so overwhelmed and just done to learn the lesson and to do the work.
Yeah. One, I think you can find it valuable too to be in the position that you're in, to so that they don't get to that level of harming themselves
Right.
because they didn't finally surrender,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
When realizing that's all that we have to do
Yeah.
sometimes.
Exactly.
So tell me a little bit about, you got your degree, your doctorate
Yeah.
degree,
Yeah.
and just give me a brief like intro to where you are now, like a little the
Yeah.
steps of where
Yeah.
your practice is.
Yeah. So after getting my degree, I worked in a couple different settings, and really, I mean, I think this started coming up for me my first year in graduate school. I was sitting in these lectures and I was kind of hearing the way we were supposed to be as therapists, right? In these treatment models and these modalities, and this is how we do it, right? And a lot of it felt like it was this very medical model, right? Somebody comes in with a disease or some aspect of them that they feel is broken, and you fix them. And somehow that just wasn't resonating with me. And I learned, my freshman year, my first year in grad school, I came across a book that a friend gave me that was called The Gift of Therapy. And it's by this therapist, Irving Yalom, who just sees and understands therapy to be more of a humanly based, like two humans in a room doing
Relationship.
work together,
Right, right, right.
relationship. And that resonated with me in a powerful way. So when I worked at these couple other places, I realized that the system, what it was really creating was more of this model of sickness, and you come to me to get fixed, and then you leave and we put a band-aid on it, and when you feel sick again you come back and I fix
Right.
you. It just didn't seem like the morally or ethically right thing to do. It didn't feel like the right thing in my heart. So I went out and I started my own practice, so that I can do the work the way it felt right to me. Um, and then sort of as a way to feel like, to give back to the field, instead of hiring people that were already licensed, I wanted to hire people that were in their intern or postdoc years.
So you don't
And
have to retrain or
right,
reprogram.
right. And so having being able to train them for a year, or some of them even for 2 years, about this different way of being a therapist, about being more humanistic, about really sort of understanding the suffering, and not being in this place of wanting to fix anybody.
Right.
That's, that truly the person coming in already has everything that they need inside them, that we just have to be a compassionate mirror to show them who they really are, stripped of those stories, stripped of the conditioning, and then allow them to access their own motivation, their own values, their own drive to then get themselves out of the situation that they are. And so that's kind of the practice that we've been developing. And you'll see it's on our website, it's on the T-shirts we sell. It's okay not to be okay. That's sort of our campaign. It's our message. It's not. We don't want to just deliver really quality, good therapy services. We want to be an entity where people can sort of understand that therapy can look differently. That it's about growth. That it's about change. That it's about coming into your truth. And
Yes.
it's not about just having a symptom and we're trying to fix that symptom.
Right. And I loved how you said it's coming into your truth. It's finding out who you really are
Right.
versus like, okay, I have anxiety. We need to fix the
Right.
anxiety.
Right.
Okay, we need to stem out, where did this anxiety come from and why are you feeling like that? It's your anxiety. I think a lot of people attach themselves.
Exactly.
It's my depression.
Right.
It's my food.
Right.
It's
Right.
my autoimmune disorder. You
Yeah.
don't own these things unless
Yeah.
you want it to
Yeah.
attach to you.
Exactly.
Right. Right.
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
love
So
that.
it's a
Awesome.
shift. It's a shift, and it's just been beautiful to watch, right? Like when you bring that kind of attitude and style to your work, people start to heal from really massive things. And it's not uncommon for me to have someone come in and be like, I saw this therapist for a year, 6 months, and like it helped for a few months, and then here we are again. But with this work, when it's deeper and it's more profound, the healing that takes place, the change that takes place, and for the amount of time, it's a longer course thing. To watch that sort of transpire in front of you is just it's the most rewarding and beautiful thing I get to experience. It's an absolute honor to do the work that I do.
Oh my gosh, I can tell how passionate you are about it.
Yeah, yeah,
And you also shared that you continued your own journey of your
yeah.
truth. You want to
Yeah,
share a little bit about
yeah,
that?
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, I think even after really learning a lot of where my own unworthiness was stemming from, and some of the messages in my own childhood, even through therapy, I felt like I got to a place where, um, even doing some trauma work, that um, there was still some aspects of me that I didn't truly understand and know very well. And I wasn't able to reach them with therapy, it seemed like. Um, and so, how do I sort of get more acquainted with my unconscious? And I had learned about different plant medicines, throughout the years. And sort of around that time, now I was a business owner. And so not only was I mean, the therapy work was feeling great, but some of that old wiring had
Yeah.
been coming in as a business owner. And here I was like, my business, and trying to
Yeah.
grind every day. And after that
Yes.
dollar still, and like,
Oh,
oh
I
my goodness,
know.
it's
Chasing that
happening
rabbit.
again, right? It's happening again. And just found myself here now doing something I loved, but the programming and conditioning was starting to make its way into it again and taking the value out of it. And what I realized is, oh, this isn't a product of me and the work that I do. This is a product of the way that I think. And as long as I continue to think or come from a mind frame that there is something missing within me or in my life that I am lacking, then I'm always going to want more. And as
Yes.
long as I'm wanting more, I'm going to be on that, in that rut, on that rat
Right. And you're going to
race.
keep chasing things without outside of yourself. Like,
Right.
what's the next thing? What's the next thing?
And I just realized that that's absolutely empty, that it was an illusion,
Yeah.
because here I had accomplished all of this stuff. And yet I
Hmm.
was feeling this still this same thing. So I wanted to find out what that was. So in July of last year, I found myself in Costa Rica on an ayahuasca retreat. And that week just changed everything. It changed everything I understood about myself. It changed everything. It changed so many of my relationships. It helped me understand myself from a deeply, deeply unconscious place,
Mhm.
from a more spiritual place. For me, there was also a real spiritual connection. There's a lot of people that work with plant medicines where they have that connection. Um, and so it gave me a new outlook on life. It sort of just opened my eyes to see that the ways I had been living and some of the models that I had been using were not serving me anymore. Yeah, I came back and I started to what we call reintegrate, to sort of see, like, with this other vision that I've seen of myself and what I'm capable of, what's my life purpose now? Um, my work with clients went on a much, much deeper and more loving sort of level and place. My relationship with my parents started to evolve and change. There was more compassion and empathy. My relationship with my wife deepened and just got much more beautiful. Um, and
You kind of awaken to this other side of yourself.
yeah, yeah. And my fiance and I had been trying to get pregnant for almost 3 years and had numerous IVF attempts and failures and heartbreak. And I came back from this trip at the beginning in August. And in November, we found out that we were pregnant. And
Can't be, I mean, what a gift.
yeah,
Would you say,
yeah,
just to, I always like to get a better understanding of how the medicine worked for you. Obviously it tapped into the subconscious of the things that we already know within
right,
ourselves. What was just a brief experience that I know
yeah,
it's such a 4 day. I mean, I can only
yeah, yeah, yeah,
imagine how each day was.
totally.
But what was something that was very significant that was it a visual? Was it a
Yeah,
knowing? What
yeah,
was that really shifted your consciousness?
yeah. One of the common things you'll hear people who have had these experiences talk about is a knowing, right? Up until that point in my life, I felt like the way I knew things was through my rational, logical mind. If I can understand it, then it's true. I experienced something that it's just like a knowing, like it's in your heart. Like it's just like when you know something to be the case,
Mhm.
and no one can convince you otherwise,
Right.
no matter how much rationale or logic you
There
use.
and there is no logic behind it because there's no proof. You just know it to be true,
You
and that is
just
it.
know it because you've experienced it,
Yeah.
right? And so, a really good friend that I met there that week said, he sort of explained it like the difference between knowing and knowing. And now I was knowing things in life. And so, like, I'll briefly talk about one of the visions I had the first night. I'm sort of pulled out into like the middle of the universe. So there's like infinity in all directions around me, right?
Mhm.
And there's this complex figure that sort of shows up with like all these colors, and it goes off in infinite directions. And my brain couldn't wrap my mind around what the hell this thing is and what it does and what its purpose. And then I sort of hear this thing within me say, like, what do you know about quantum physics? And I was like, "Mm."
Wow.
I was like,
Nothing.
I know nothing. And it's like, what do you know about like painting, like being a painter? And I'm like, nothing. And it was like, how long do you want to play this game? For how eternally long do you want to
Ah,
play how much you don't know? And the reflection in that moment was, silly human, in your day-to-day life, you are out here trying to control everything, thinking you know the things, the way they're going to play out, trying to control for every aspect of everything in your life. Do you see the ways that you are not in control? Let go of the anxiety, let go of that need to think that you have it all figured out, because that's not getting you anywhere. And so that helped
wow,
me
that is really amazing.
really shift this relationship around, my anxiety and letting go of control, and not feeling like
Because
I
we're
had.
really not in control of anything, and we really don't know
We're not.
anything.
We're
We
not.
know this much.
Most of us don't even want to sit with that
Yeah,
idea of thinking
yeah.
about
The one thing I want to relate real quick to you is with hypnosis and following Dolores Cannon. She's this
it. Yeah,
particular uh she's the hypnotherapist that created that technique, quantum
yeah,
healing. quantum healing hypnosis.
Right, right.
And from all the sessions that she's done and the people that have gone through and spoke from their higher self, which is always recorded, and it's
Yeah,
amazing. She's
yeah.
created these books to say we spoon feed you because if
Right.
we gave you all, we would blow your mind. You wouldn't be able to
Totally.
handle it.
Well,
So
I
it's funny
mean,
how it's like it played that game with you, like the higher. Okay, you want this? You think
yeah,
you know this? Just
yeah,
let go.
yeah,
Just
yeah,
experience.
yeah. It felt like that week was like I peeked behind a door and it
Yeah.
like the room was so big that I was like, okay,
You're like, I don't even know what I'm looking at.
I know. Let me process this and then we could go deeper maybe some other time. But yeah,
Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
That was really amazing though. I really
Yeah,
appreciate you sharing that story. And so now you have all this other like these tools because you've worked within.
totally.
Again,
Yeah,
now it's not about going out. Maybe it's like, okay, when I really need to find that, I'm going to go right back inside.
exactly.
And
Exactly. So
how is that?
I went from this human um, looking to external achievements to find my value and validate myself to someone who now the path is inward, quieting my mind, quieting the need for control to get into that intuitive heart space where I have all the answers. And brilliantly, as I feel tension in life or I feel lost, I go, I sit, I meditate, I quiet, and lo and behold, I find exactly what it is that I need for that next step in my life. So I don't need the control anymore. It's all sitting right in there whenever I need it. And so the journey now has become one of going inward, a meditative practice, a yoga practice, even someone who was what I call a like a righteous atheist at one point. Like I would want
Okay.
to drive my atheism into your heart.
Sure.
Yeah. And raised Catholic and had this, now I'm really into Hindu scriptures and Buddhist scriptures and seeing how a lot of the information there is sort of speaking to me in my life. And
Just the
it's not for everybody, but
curiosity.
you sort of follow your heart and what's speaking to you is what I'm saying.
I think it's great. I think you're always a student, and I can tell from your background, you've always been diving into really understanding what is put in front of you, and that's
Yeah.
okay, right? Because
Yeah.
the logic and the heart, sometimes if we can meet them together, that's a beautiful place to be, right? I think that's what we ultimately want is to be neutral, right?
Yeah.
Like we don't need to
Yeah.
be all the way over here on
Right.
darkness, right? And
Right.
depression. And we don't need to be on like
Totally.
high vibing all the time.
No.
So if we can find to bring them together,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's what I find in
I
this
had
journey.
a great visual the other day, sort of explained to me, like on a pendulum.
Yeah.
Like we don't want to be on either of those ends. So whatever work we can do ourselves to minimize the
The,
pendulum
the heavy
coming
swings.
to sort of be here.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Is there any kind of a last minute message that, or last thoughts that you have
Yeah,
to our audience based
yeah,
on what you've been working with that you want to share?
yeah. I think it would be there's this small, quiet voice that I think we all know is in there somewhere. Sometimes it's whispering, sometimes it's faint, but it's there. And I encourage anybody, whether it's through therapy, reading books, plant medicine, whatever it is that helps you get in tune with that small voice, to find what that is for you, to be an explorer, to go out there and journey, to understand yourself better, to always be a student and always want to grow and expand. Because through that, I have learned that the best way I could ever be there for you, Danielle, or any person in my life is by being there for me, by
Mm.
working on myself, by doing my work on myself and letting go of pains, resentments, agitations, anger. I come into a place of more wisdom and more compassion and more love. And that is what makes us feel inspired to want to give, to want to heal other people. And so I'll just continue to do the work on myself that allows me to be in that space so that other people can have that space.
I mean, I can feel the love already. I'd come and give you a hug right now.
Rachel, hug.
Yes, let
Yeah,
hug. Oh,
yeah,
I loved hearing more about you
yeah.
today.
Thank you.
You
Thank
have
you for
such,
having me on.
yeah, you're an amazing story, amazing person. So where can
Appreciate
people
that.
find you if they happen to be in Tampa?
Yeah. So they can find me through our website, tampacounselingandwellness.com. We're also on Tampa Counseling and Wellness on Facebook and Instagram.
Okay.
And just kind of find me through there. That's the easiest way. I do have, my own sort of separate accounts for, I do a little bit of speaking in the community and things like
Okay.
that, but that's the easiest way to find me.
Awesome.
I'm always sort of open to take people's emails and phone calls and sort of share my thoughts and hear about where they are and just share a little bit about life. So feel free to reach out anytime.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Carlos Garcia. We enjoyed speaking with you. A lot of wisdom, a lot to take back from today. And I thank you for joining the Conscious Broadcast.
Thanks for having me.